The Moon Princess by Edith Ogden Harrison. Part 1. The heavens were stainless blue, and the moon shone out of them arrayed in silvery garments. One by one the sky's matchless jewels, the stars, peeped out, studding that great ceiling with flashing diamond points, until the whole dome was a glittering mass of blue and silver. The ocean below seemed a big mirror made to catch and reflect the bewildering beauty above, for shimmering softly he carried in his shining depths all those myriad lights. Calm and majestic, the moon glided over her star-studded pathway, but in spite of her glorious beauty and brilliancy, she really was sad and sick at heart. Ethelda, her best beloved, the youngest and dearest of her children, had just made a request the granting of which caused her that night bitterest sorrow. There was an old custom among the Moon Maidens that on her marriage each one of them might ask whatever she most desired, and the thing which she asked could not be denied her. Now Ethelda of the starry eyes and the shining spun gold hair had asked a fearful gift at her mother's hands. She was betrothed to the Sun Prince Dorian, a handsome youth, strong of limb, and a goodly sight to look upon, and he had long loved her. He had seen this dainty maiden in all her varying moods, so he knew her well. Sometimes, with her moon maidens merrily engaged at play, she romped, happy as a child, or later, with the stately tread of a young princess, she came and went in her big white palace. She often wore a pale blue gown with silver trimmings, and a crown of flashing stars upon her head. And then it was the brilliantly beautiful girl looked the daughter of the skies. Prince Dorian had watched the slender maiden until every strand of her glittering hair was dear to his heart. Later, his father's golden chariot brought him daily to her palace. How Ethelda loved to watch him as he drove the fiery steeds with a master's hands, guiding them surely and steadily to her palace gates. He was the finest of the sun god's sons, and Ethelda's heart beat proudly as she looked upon her chosen one. The Moon Mother was happy too in her daughter's choice, and all would have been well in the wedding festivities, save for Ethelda's unheard-of request. How the moon hated to grant it, but she had reasoned with Ethelda long and patiently without effect, for the wilful little princess was bent upon this mad whim. Alas, no good can come of it, sighed the moon heavily, as she gazed down sadly upon the earth as she spoke. No good can come of it, she repeated. What could have possessed the child to want it? Poor Ethelda asked no less than this, to visit the earth and spend her honeymoon there. The young prince, though at first reluctant to take his beautiful bride on such a wild trip, had finally yielded to her persuasions, and now, being won by her tender pleadings, was as anxious to go as she. But the Moon Mother had no faith in this foolish journey. Her mind misgave her, and as she swung around the great circle in celestial glory, her heart grew tremulous with fear for her daughter's safety. The request must be granted, that she knew, but she was devoutly thankful for a wise law requiring a moon maiden to revisit her own home yearly. At most, then, she could stay but a 12-month upon the earth. Reason as she would, however, the Queen Mother's heart was heavy, for with the daughter upon the earth the mother's happiness would be gone. But the maiden's joy at the consent consoled her somewhat, and with the unselfish mother's love, the queen was determined to hide her own grief and make the wedding trip a brilliant and joyous one. Prince Dorian came with a great retinue of knights, all dressed in shining gold wrought in the sun's fiery furnace, and bringing wonderful jewels to his bride. The Moon Queen, not to be outdone in magnificence, showered silver in plenty upon them both, and bade 100 of her loveliest maidens accompany the bridal pair upon their journey. The wedding was so brilliant that the skies grew bright as day, and the splendor was reflected for many miles across the heavens. When the ceremony was over, the bride in shining white and silver garments came forth from the circle of her bridesmaids to bid her mother farewell. Long-limbed and graceful was this daughter of the skies. Her blonde hair hung in yellow masses to her knees, while her tender blue eyes, looking smilingly upon her mother's face, were radiant with happiness. Gliding swiftly forward, she reached the throne, and there, sinking on her knees, she begged her mother's blessing. Very tenderly, the queen watched her graceful child approach and kneel. Then, leaning forward, she raised her to her breast and showered caresses upon her. "Ethelda, best beloved," she began, "stay not beyond your allotted time upon the earth. My heart misgives me when I think of your departure, and will be heavy until you return. But see, my daughter, I have provided for your safety as best I can, and you may come back to me whenever you choose." So saying, she drew the bride gently toward the window of her white palace, and there, looking down, Ethelda saw a wonderful sight indeed. A beautiful shimmering ladder of moonlight, stretched in infinite splendor down to the earth. Whichever way she looked, the majestic sweep of that brilliant ladder was before her. It reached the ocean, whose gigantic waves of foaming white rose to meet it, and it quivered in dazzling glory upon the green-clad forests of the land. Ethelda was amazed and delighted at the wonderful sight, and throwing her arms around her mother's neck, she poured forth her gratitude in loving words. "We will return soon, sweet mother," she whispered tenderly. "The shining steps will lead us safely back to you." Then, as her husband joined them, she stepped forward smilingly to greet him, saying she was ready. 100 of the Sun Prince's knights in trappings of gold made by the sun himself, with bright shades of crimson trimmings, joined them as he spoke. Ethelda's maidens, in their glittering dresses of white as silver, followed, and joining their hands with the knights, began their magnificent wedding march to the earth. Never was there a more kingly sight. Preceding the bride and bridegroom, the gay cavalcade descended the glorious ladder of silver beams. Step by step they wandered down the moon-glade toward the earth, and the moon, smiling lovingly at them, sighed again heavily as she spread her bright pathway of silver before them. Now the earth knew of their coming, and she determined to give them a welcome befitting their high and mighty rank. She already owed a great debt to the Sun King, for it was his shining rays that warmed and nourished her, and made her fruitful. Most of her splendid fertility was due to the warmth of the sun. So she invited the whole world to meet the bridal party, giving a grand ball in their honor. The invitations were taken by the winds and swiftly carried to the four corners of the globe. Hundreds of noble personages were asked to meet the distinguished strangers, and all came to do them honor, bringing cordial greetings and invitations to visit the different parts of the world. The night of the ball had come. The earth, resplendent in jewels, awaited the arrival of her guests. The forest back of them was aglitter with lights, for all the glowworms and fireflies had been summoned for the occasion, and for days they had been decorating the trees. An orchestra of birds sang delicious music, and overhead the sky was spangled with twinkling stars, gazing in silent wonderment upon the earth's splendor. By the side of the Earth Queen stood Prince Dorian. His suit of pure gold shone like the sun himself, and next to him was his beautiful bride, the Moon Princess. She was dressed in white garments embroidered in silver, and she was certainly a charming vision. Her gleaming yellow hair was caught back from her forehead with a crown of flashing stars. Her clear blue eyes, with their deep sky tints, were dancing in lights as brilliant as her star crown itself. First came the earth's eldest son, the Ocean King, to greet them. The earth was a mass of fire with gleaming phosphorus, and King Ocean and his mermaid daughters seemed to be floating in red flames as they approached. The maiden's long and wonderfully beautiful hair floated behind them as they swam, and they sang the most entrancing songs. They bore an invitation to Prince Dorian and his bride to visit them in their marine home. and this invitation was at once accepted by the strangers. Another invitation, accepted at once, came for Prince Dorian's only sister, Princess Culda, who lived upon the earth with her husband. Many more charming invitations were given them, but of course it was impossible to accept them all. At last one distinguished-looking person strode forward, small of stature and ugly to look upon. His body was dwarfed, and he had a big hump on his back. His face was glowering, and he wore a suit of yellow leaves. All the guests moved aside to let him pass, as though they feared him. He lived in the vast depths of the forest, amidst huge mountains. His daily work, with his thousands of imps, was to build those mountains big and high. Stone by stone he raised them, bleak and barren, to the clouds. He limped as he walked, and he glared angrily at the shrinking faces avoiding him. But he gave his invitation to the fair guests as others had done, and bowed low before them as he gave it. Involuntary shudder ran through the lovely princess as she heard his words, and suddenly clung to her husband in terror. As the dwarf's eyes dwelt admiringly upon her, she felt a cold thrill of fear at his bold glance. But Prince Dorian, reassuring her with a tender smile, turned to the ugly creature, and to the astonishment of the Earth Queen and her court, replied, "Sir Dwarf, we accept your invitation, and will gladly ride forth with you whenever our hostess wills. The Sun King, my father, and Her Majesty the Queen of the Moon, have each sent the earth a gift, as a glad token of our visit here, and we must place our precious gold and silver deep within the bosom of your great mountains. There it will thrive and grow, increasing and benefiting the world." The Moon Princess turned very pale when she heard her husband's reply, but the dwarf limped away with a gratified smile upon his ugly face. Chapter 2. How the Wedding Guests Visited the Caves of Ocean. The Ocean King and his daughters came early for their guests. They had driven fast, and their sea-horses were covered with a lather of white foam. As they came shoreward, the rising sun dyed the sky a brilliant pink, and for a moment the water caught its color, and then it was delightful to watch the great rolling waves of the sea blushing a delicate rosy shade. Ethelda, with Prince Dorian and their friends, stood on the creamy sands awaiting them. The Moon Princess wore a gown to match her blue eyes, and its exquisite train, embroidered in silver crescents, hung in heavy folds behind her. Stepping lightly into the Ocean King's chariot, Ethelda sat beside him. Prince Dorian followed, and very soon the whole party were comfortably seated among the mermaids. Away they started. Some snowy birds, watching them off, rose suddenly and, outstretching their long white wings, floated lazily away. Billions of sapphire waves rolled in to meet them, but the horses sped easily through, leaving only a broad roadway of foam behind. The shining sun spread out over the wide expanse, and they seemed to be flying through golden mists, while their great frothy path glittered in as many colors as the rainbow. Farther and farther they went. Deeper and deeper grew the rich color of the great deep, until it seemed impossible it could become bluer. Then slowly that brilliant blue changed, becoming a clear, cool green, the shade of the coldest waters. Not until then did the Ocean King draw rein, and slowly descending, they finally stopped at the gates of his palace. The palace was a wonder to behold. Its walls were built of the richest mother of pearl, and shaded from purest white to the most delicate rose. Its broad staircases and wide halls were all of the same costly material, while its trimmings and ornamentations were pearls and diamonds of priceless worth. To keep the white light from dazzling with its splendor, the tall green seaweeds waved about, lending a delicious cool shade, like the green trees on the dry land, so that everything was agreeable to the eye. The Ocean Queen came forth with her younger children to greet them, and Ethelda thought she had never seen anything so delicately beautiful as the Queen. Her eyes were as clear as crystal pools, and her hair, a bewildering mass of gold, floated around her, covering her almost completely. She wore a pale green dress trimmed with magnificent pearls, and on her head a crown of diamonds. She glided up to the strangers, and in the softest voice bade them welcome. A magnificent banquet was served immediately, and then they were shown the wonders of the sea palace. Rooms filled with costly treasures were opened. Chests of brilliant jewels were examined. But while the guests were enchanted with so much splendor, the king explained that to the mermaid kingdom these heaps of diamonds and emeralds and rubies were not really worth a single piece of coral, for at these huge coral beds in the bottom of the sea, the baby mermaids received their education. They were taught to swim and play games and amuse themselves, and later they lent their deft fingers to build and carve those exquisite mountains of the sea. When the Moon Maidens saw the coral beds, they too shared the mermaid's belief. The party were walking ahead through the clear, smooth waters when presently they saw a slight ruffle, and almost immediately they saw a long, pink line. It was the coral reef, and as they approached, they saw great sheets of roaring foam hiss over the slippery coral, and as they passed by the hissing walls of foam, they saw that the tiny builders had raised their rose-colored mountains to a great height. The delicate work was a marvel to see. It was like the weaving of the finest lacework, and only the smartest of the mermaids were employed to carve the coral beds. "Can earth exhibit greater wonders?" exclaimed Prince Dorian. "We think not," answered the Ocean King, "but it is perhaps because we love our home so much. We have many more wonderful things we could show you, but our time is limited, and we can only briefly display our favorites." Turning, he took from the hand of one of his daughters a beautiful shell. Creamy and shining like satin was the outside of the curving piece of mother of pearl, but its lovely lining was as pink as a rose leaf. Presenting it to Ethelda, the king bade her keep it to remind her of her visit to his dwelling. "This beautiful shell, fair princess," continued the king, "shares with the mermaid kingdom its great love of home, and it carries deep within its heart the sound of the waves. It will never lose it. No matter where it goes or how long it stays, if you hold it to your ear, it will speak to you of us, for the deep musical sounds of the waves will always be heard singing within its depths." Ethelda, delighted, thanked him for the charming gift, which she gratefully accepted. Then, continuing their walk, they arrived at the door of a handsome palace where the Ocean King's only sister lived. She was called the Princess Seafoam, and her palace was built entirely of pearls. Great oysters were constantly employed making these pearls for her, and day after day they opened their wide mouths and deposited fresh beauties at her doors. Her apartments were all elegant and in white, and the Ocean King's guests were especially astonished at the magnificence of the princess's clothing. She was very beautiful, for her skin was clear and her features delicate and pretty. She was small of stature and looked more like a fairy than a mermaid, but her dress amazed them by its beauty. It was snow white and was studded with the largest and purest diamonds they had ever seen. Even her hair was covered with precious stones, and wherever she moved, sparkles of lights burst forth. When she approached closer, they discovered that the shining jewels were not really diamonds at all, but clear and brilliant raindrops. The Seafoam Princess was in reality also the Rain Princess, her duty was to lie frequently atop the waves and travel about, watching the dry land and the sea. Often one sees the broad blue waters flecked with white specks, then one knows that Seafoam and her companions, in their white dresses, are watching the world to determine when rain is needed. It is a great responsibility for such a tiny princess, but she has guided her millions of followers wisely, and the earth is well pleased with her lovely daughter's work. They make the precious raindrops and then store them away in a big room in the Pearl Palace. When the rain is needed, the doors are opened, and the skies absorb the moisture. The heavens fill with clouds, at first glorious shining masses, lying against the blue sky, as white and as foamy as the princess herself on the blue waves. But later, gathering force, they darken to a gray or black, and fall upon the earth in a shower of glittering drops. Over and over again must Seafoam do this wonderful work, but it is work of joy, because she loves those glittering drops of shining water. The sun warms the world and gives it heat, but the ocean must cool and freshen it with raindrops, for all the rain that falls from the sky must be first gathered on the earth, and this responsibility rests on the Ocean King's sister, dainty little Seafoam.